attention. My name is David Darling. I'm Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science here at GW. And I want to offer a warm welcome to everybody. If you haven't been here before, you're in the Science and Engineering Hall. This is our new home of 3 years. It's a fabulous building. So if you get a chance tonight after the reception, hang out, walk around, and just take a look. But I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the inaugural CVP lecture. And this new lecture series will bring speakers to GW to discuss timely topics around change, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. And this lecture series was made possible because of a gift by a SEAS alumnus and a SEAS National Advisory Council member, Anirudh Kulkarni, who's in the front row, who will be coming up in a moment. He is also the founder and CEO of CVP, CVP being Customer Value Partners. Tonight, we're pleased to have Dr. David Bray, who's Executive Director of People-Centered Internet, here to deliver the kickoff event in this lecture series. So thank you for joining us. Before I invite Anirudh up to formally introduce Dr. Bray and say a few words about him, let me say a few words about Anirudh. This is like a cascading step. This is very brief. At an early age, and you can stand up and correct me if I make mistakes about your bio, at an early age, Anirudh had a love of data analytics, math, applied math, pure math, how they all fitted together, and how they could be combined to do useful things. And so not entirely surprisingly, he earned a bachelor's degree from here, from SEAS, actually from GW. We don't give degrees, the university does, but I like to say SEAS degree, in operations research and computational science with concentrations in statistics and economics. That was back in 1986, which for some of the young people here, that's way, way back. And he earned a SEAS MS in operations research and management a couple of years later in 1988. And after he graduated, he went to work for TRW for 3 years, I believe. But at age 25, and this is an inspiration, I think, to many of the young people here, he left TRW to start his own company, focused, not surprisingly, on consumer product analysis. And this paved the way for the company he'd found in 2002, and which is today CVP, of which he is obviously the founder and the CEO. I'll skip to just saying that Anirudh perhaps will say a little bit about what CVP does, but the company boasts a number of awards and distinctions, including being named to the fastest growing companies list in the Washington Business Journal and Inc. 5000. And I think the award with the greatest significance for Anirudh is CVP's being named to the top workplaces list in the Washington Post, a confirmation that he's created the type of company that he envisaged at the beginning. So Anirudh, thank you for your generous gift for endowing this lecture series. For those of you who don't know what an endowment is, a donor gives an amount of cash. We invest it, it produces income, and it supports a lecture series forever. So 100 years from now, some dean will be standing here introducing the 100th CVP speaker, or more, because there'll be more per year. So, Anirudh, would you like to come and say a few words about the speaker and perhaps yourself? Thanks.
Thank you. 100 years, wow. The dean may still be here. This is a man who doesn't show his age, regardless of what you all might think. Dean Darling, thank you for those words. I want to keep my remarks very brief. Thank you so much for coming for what I think will be an exhilarating and exciting lecture by Dr. David Bray. David, some years ago, we're now heading into our 15th year as a company, and those of you who have been following the pace of change in society are not going to be surprised when I tell you it took 100 years for the telephone invented by Alexander Graham Bell to get to 1 billion customers. It took 100 years to find its way into the hands of 1 billion people. Facebook 8 years, WhatsApp 5, right? The pace of adoption on technology is moving at a crazy pace. Second observation that we sort of started to look at CVP about a couple of years ago is, and this is not going to come as any surprise to those of you who are millennials, but for the first time in history, we actually have more millennials in the workforce than we have baby boomers. And everything about our economy, everything about our society, any of the structures that we have got in place today have really been a post-war example of driven by that generation. And now we have millennials coming and streaming into the workforce. They are our customers, they are our workers, they are our consumers. And social scientists once said that one of the most interesting thing about millennials is that what was new and interesting 6 months ago is stale and boring today. So they crave and they live on change. So we've got tech change, we've got workforce and expectation change, and the folks at CVP, we started thinking a little bit about, well, what does that mean for decision making? If you are a client of a large enterprise and you're dealing with both technology changing at this crazy pace that we're talking about, and you're dealing with consumers and workers and citizens whose expectations keep changing continuously, what does that mean if you are the chief information officer of a large enterprise? What does it mean if you're the CEO of a large customer-facing company? How do you make decisions? So that's what really inspired the lecture series that we wanted to launch with my alma mater, GW. We wanted to use it as a forum to educate, share, collaborate, and learn from each other about the things that really are going to drive this next set of challenges around continuous change and how innovation can be used to help drive that. The solutions are not technical. The solutions are all culture, leadership, attitude, aptitude, inclination. They're social solutions. They're not technical solutions. And that's really why I wanted to do this in the engineering school. Because as engineers, we're left brain thinkers. We don't usually think in the terms of how does this affect society? I mean, we do, but not at a very intimate level. And to me, to do this with the engineering school as a partner was really a bit of a dream, and I'm thankful to the school and to the dean for allowing us to do this with you. So without further ado, I'd like to make a few comments about our distinguished guest today and welcome him. And you're in for a treat. I've heard him speak before, and it is just exhilarating. So Dr. David Bray is currently the executive director of the People-Centered Internet Coalition that was founded by the true inventor of the internet, Vint Cerf, not Al Gore. He is also a visiting executive in residence at Harvard, Oxford, and the Singularity universities. He has been identified as one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world under 40 by Business Insider. Prior to his current assignment, he was the Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, where he won not one, but 2 awards as Global CIO 100, an award that's usually reserved for Fortune 500 company leaders. He is also an Eisenhower Fellow and a Marshall Fellow to Europe in 2018, and really focused. We have Emmanuel Macron in the house, not our house, but down the street. David Bray, and I believe, was he also a Marshall Fellow? Is that right? But David's area of focus is really focusing on the state of the transatlantic relationship, kind of timely. Previously, he led the technology response for the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, in preparation for 9/11, the anthrax issue in 2001, SARS, and monkeypox. He was a senior strategic advisor in Afghanistan in 2009, helping the military think differently about their role and how that affected humanitarian assistance in the region. He has spent the last several years really thinking about what does it mean to be a positive change agent. I can't think of a better person to welcome up to the dais and tell us a little bit about his thoughts and helping us all be positive change agents. Thank you.
So that is a very humbling introduction. I now have to sort of exceed expectations. I usually like to just say I fell on my head at an early age, the rest is history, and go from there. But I first and foremost want to thank GW for hosting us, CVP for this wonderful speaker series. And listening to all that, it was interesting because I was reflecting about 10 years ago, I was finishing my PhD. 10 years ago before that, I was a sophomore doing computer science and biology. And so I was in your shoes in a lot of cases. And if you think about it, not all those events were necessarily happy ones. I mean, 9/11 clearly, that was a tragedy. SARS, fortunately, we did avoid having SARS become a larger outbreak, but still, it was not necessarily the best times. Afghanistan, I think, is still going on, and even though maybe some things have changed, it still needs to be adapted. And there's still other challenges we face as well. And so, being a positive change agent oftentimes means you're trying to bring a non-anxious presence that is trying to help make sense of the turbulence around you and try to build bridges across different groups that might not be talking to each other or might be split apart for whatever reason and try to move forward. It doesn't mean you're always successful, but it's why we need to sort of move forward as positive change agents, because exactly what you heard about the changing acceleration of technology adoption is having ripple effects that are also impacting our societies. So as we look forward to the next 10, 15 years ahead, I want to ask the first question, which is, can anyone tell me what this is a photo of? Earth, exactly. That is a picture of Earth. It was actually taken in 1990 when Voyager 1 turned around and took a photo of that iconic pale blue dot, which was our planet. It took 5.5 hours for sunlight to be reflected from the surface of Earth to be captured by Voyager 1, and then another 5.5 hours for radio waves to beam back the signal to reconstruct that image. Now, what I want to talk about, to just give you a sense of how rapid change is, and it's something that we sometimes don't really recognize, that what makes this different than any other time in human history, let's talk about when Voyager 1 launched, when it took that photo, to where we are now. So Voyager 1 launched in 1977. There was about 4.2 human beings on the face of the planet. And for those of you who are around, you remember the Apple II went on sale with a whopping 4 kilobytes of RAM. It was enough to play maybe 2 or 3 seconds of an MP3 file. Now, I remember using one of those in elementary school, but I know in other cases that was, in some cases, being used in the workplace. But I share that because that was 1977. By the time it's actually traveled to take that photo, it's traveled about 3.7 billion miles to take that pale blue dot photo. We're now looking at about 5.3 billion human beings on the face of the planet. Windows 3.0 so goes on sale, if you remember that version. And remember, it was 16-bit operating system. That's kind of sort of dating us, I guess. And a young Tim Berners-Lee turns on the first web server ever in December of 1990. Any guesses as to how many web servers are on the face of the planet now? Any guesses? Do I hear 10 million? 100 million? What if I told you the estimates are upwards of more than 1.2 billion web servers, just web servers on the face of the planet, upwards from 1 in 1990? That's massive change. And that's just web servers. So I want to pause in the year 2013, however, because that was the year I would posit that we made history and most people never noticed it. There were 7.1 billion human beings on the face of the planet and about 7.1 billion network devices, not all connected to the internet, but 7.1 billion network devices relative to 7.1 billion human beings. Now, not obviously distributed equitably. Some countries obviously have more. I imagine most of us, how many of us have more than at least 6 different computing devices, including our mobile phone, our car, probably our house, and other devices. So obviously, we are part of that proliferation of network devices. GDP had tripled by that point in time, and there were about 4 billion terabytes of data on the face of the planet, 4 zettabytes. Now, 4 billion terabytes, put that in perspective, some say that the text holdings alone for the Library of Congress, text holdings alone, are about 10 terabytes, some say. So to give you a sense, I'm really talking about 400 million versions of the text holdings of the Library of Congress. Some of those are probably cat videos and other things like that, but it raises interesting questions. And it's worth pausing because estimates just a year ago is that within 1 minute, 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube. Think about it. Every minute we're uploading 500 hours of video. So you're not going to run out of things to watch. It might be monotonous, but it's there. Just 2 years prior to it, the ratio was 70 to 80 hours. So it's not doubling, it's doing something geometric at that point. And that raises massive questions about where that's going to go. So, 2022, we're looking just 4 years into the future from now. If we follow current trends, estimates are anywhere between 75 and 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet, relative to 8 billion human beings. That's going to raise interesting questions about privacy. That's going to raise interesting questions about civil liberties. How are we going to live in that world? How are we going to secure that world? We're already seeing challenges with cybersecurity now, and we're not even in this area in which there's this proliferation of network devices. What does that look like, and how do we survive? There's no textbook for that. In terms of the 8 billion human beings, we're going to hit the tipping point in December of this year in which it's estimated that about half the planet will be connected. But that also means we still have to bring on another half of the planet. And by 2022, 4 years from now, if things go well, we'll be up to about 7 of the billion being connected. That means we're going to bring online another about 3.4 billion human beings in the next 4 years, relative to 3.6 billion that will be online in December of this year. So we're almost going to effectively double the amount of people operating online in the next 4 years. And again, that's going to raise questions about privacy, who owns the data, what's done with the data you produce, how do we operate in this world? There is no textbook for that world we're going into. And the estimates are by that point in time, we're looking at 96 billion terabytes of data, 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress's text holdings. Or to put that in another perspective, some say that's more data than all human eyes on the planet see in the course of a year. Another way to put it, it's twice all the conversations we've ever had as a species. I would submit at that point in time, 4 years from now, if not already, search by keyword will no longer be sufficient. How many of us go past the 4th or 5th pages of search results? If you don't, you're probably going to miss something that could either be useful or helpful, or something that could allow something bad to be avoided and be mitigated. This is probably already happening in organizations where the data's there, but they don't know how to bring it together. And so unfortunately, bad things happen, or they miss out on avoiding, or actually seizing on good things, because it's too late by the time they bring it together. We're going to have to think about how we actually have data that's aware of what you're doing, aware of the context of what you're doing, and it says, would this be useful? But then that raises interesting questions about privacy. If those people who don't opt in to having that sort of monitoring and having that data be provided to them, will they be at a disadvantage when this digital tsunami happens versus those who do? These are huge questions, and again, there's no textbook for where we're going, and that's why we need positive change agents, because we're going to have to do experiments, and we're going to have to figure out how to survive in this era. So who can tell me what this is a photo of? Yes?
Printing press.
Printing press, exactly. Specifically the Gutenberg printing press. Gutenberg printing press, it allowed the distribution of knowledge that you no longer had to actually make books by hand. You could actually now mass produce them. And so the freedom of ideas started to be exchanged. What is this a photo of? Any guesses?
The internet?
It was the internet, specifically the broadband connection circa 2014, which means you could probably multiply this by 2 to overlay the mobile connections as well, because there's actually now more mobile broadband connections than there are actual landline broadband connections in the world. But I share that because just like the printing press began to give rise of the distribution of ideas that you no longer actually had to have a pricey handmade book, but now other people could begin to see ideas. It began to then about 200 years later, the questions about should we organize by a different way? That maybe that king is not necessarily almighty or anointed by the divine. Instead, maybe we should organize by geography. And maybe we should have more rational ways of organizing. And it gave rise to actually what this country was descended upon, which was the experiment in self-governance. And that was only possible by the rise of those ideas. It's also worth thinking about when the printing press first came out. Machiavelli, when he actually wrote his treatise, The Prince, his book was very thick. Later you have John Locke and Hobbes, their books get thinner. Then you have Mills and others, and their books get even thinner. Is it that Mills is just more brief and more terse compared to Machiavelli? Or is it that as you get more progression with the printing of the books, you don't have to hide what you're saying? Because if you say what you say when the printing press first came out, the king might realize that you're actually challenging his authority and might get killed. But then a little bit later, you can actually come out and say more what you mean and you won't get killed. And so it's an interesting sort of trend that you look at the treaties and they get thinner and thinner as they go forward. And it's not that I think philosophers are getting more brief in what they're saying, it's just they can say it more openly as opposed to what was present in the 1400s. And I raise that because with the internet now, we can share ideas on unprecedented scale. Anybody can say whatever they want. In fact, anyone can be a publisher. But as talking with Vint Cerf once, he said that's also the downside, is anybody can be a publisher. And so now we're trying to figure out, how do we make sense of that world? What is truth? I celebrate that we're becoming more transparent. That is excellent. It also raises questions, so are we becoming armchair quarterbacks of either organizations or governments and being judgmental, saying how could they have possibly done it? And we're taking things out of context. And so this is a question about the world we go into, as to how do we live in this world in which anyone can be a publisher, anyone can say anything, and that's not even just assuming that people are saying truth. How do we also deal with a world in which there may be misinformation out there as well? And that raises questions because just like the Treaty of Westphalia came about 200 years after the printing press and gave rise to nation states have only been here for about 450 years. There may be other ways of organizing that are different from that. Maybe we need new network ways of organizing that transcend geography, because where is a packet of information on the internet? Is it where it's sent from? Is it where it's received by? We're going to find out in May of this year, because how many people know what GDPR is? Excellent. You should. If you don't, it's European General Data Regulation Protection. Basically, it's when Europe is going to say there's going to be certain rules that apply to the data and the privacy that need to be applied to it, regardless of whether you're in Europe or not. If you think you're holding data on someone who's from Europe, you need to apply those rules. So it's going to be this sort of interesting test of applying laws outside of a specific country. Interesting questions as to where we're going to go. So we need people to be positive change agents, because precisely for the reason there is no textbook how we make sense of this exponential era of change. If I haven't hopefully already convinced you, the next 7 years are going to see more change than the last 2 decades combined. How many people already feel like things are moving too fast? Just checking. So buckle your safety belts, you've seen nothing yet. This is going to raise interesting questions, and it's going to call into question, how do we even lead positively in this era? Because we're going to make mistakes. There is no guide rote book. It's not like you can do A leads to B leads to C. We're going to have to experiment. How many people know about Project Corona? Project Corona was an effort in 1958, 1959 with the Advanced Research Projects Agency, where supposedly the senior executive that was put in charge didn't even know what he was told, you're now in charge of Project Corona. He's like, great, what is it? And they said, your assignment is to lead a team that will launch a rocket into space. This was 1958, so before going to the moon and everything like that. 1958, launch a rocket into space, take a photo of the Soviet Union, parachute a film capsule over the ocean, and have it be picked up by a helicopter before it lands into the ocean. Because once it lands in the ocean, it's no good anymore. 1958. The first 13 rockets blew up and never left the launch pad. It wasn't until about attempt number 21, 22 that they successfully finally retrieved the film canister. But later, this became the basis. When it became declassified, it started being shared. In 1995, they declassified the maps. They were bought by a company called Keyhole, which was later bought by Google. And Google Maps actually uses the basis of what came from Project Corona back in 1958. This is why I actually say, you may think government's not innovative. I would say government's innovative. It's just that we don't monetize the innovations we do. We leave that to somebody else. But I share that because imagine we try to do that Project Corona nowadays. How many of us would have watched the rocket explode and maybe on attempt number 4 or 5 said, what's going on there? We need to have an investigation. We need to have an hearing. They're wasting taxpayers' dollars. This is never going to work. We've lost the appetite to experiment. Again, I celebrate that we've become more transparent, but we've also become more judgmental too. And the question is, how do we lead in this era in which people are paralyzed to do nothing because that's better than doing something and being wrong or not having it work out? And that raises interesting questions about how do we maintain living as a pluralistic representative society? Or is it a case that if you're an autocracy, you're better off because you don't care what anyone else thinks? If we reward those people that are risk averse and fall into line and follow and do what they say, then we actually give up, unfortunately, on pluralism. So, on that happy note, I'm going to now give you 3 guides as to how to survive in this coming era. And the first is, it's been shown that diversity trumps ability. What do I mean by that? Well, in 2002, there was a National Academy study in which they took a group of experts and they wanted to see if they could solve a problem better than a group of experts plus what they called naive participants, people who did not have expertise in the subject. And what they found out is that the experts plus naive participants did better than the experts combined. You're like, well, why was that the case? Well, the interesting thing is, you think about it this: when you become an expert, you start seeing the world in certain ways. You have certain heuristics that are tacit. It's hard to explain, but you see that and you're like, oh, that must be X or that must be Y. And when anyone asks why, it's just like, well, my experiences up until now has led me to believe that's X or Y. But those can become blind spots. Frank Lloyd Wright, point in case, an amazing architect, but he was an awful engineer. His buildings are now falling apart. It would have been much better to pair Frank Lloyd Wright as an amazing architect with a really good engineer, and maybe while you're at it, a conservationist as well, and you would have had a much better product that would stand the test of time versus just Frank Lloyd Wright as the expert. And so in some respects, a naive participant brings other ways of looking at the world that are different than the expert themselves. Now, I'm not saying we don't need experts. In fact, what I think we really need is a plurality of different expertise working together to look at problems. And in fact, I worry that the internet is actually causing a flattening in which no longer do we reward anyone for being an expert in anything. Because now I can go to the internet and I can find something that confirms my opinion, and even though I have no expertise in this subject, you must be wrong because I can find it on the internet. And so I think we face this challenge, which is what we really want is a diversity of people that look at the world in different ways, and we find a way to work together on shared goals. And that gets to the interesting case, which is actually diversity only trumps ability if you set shared goals up front. If you don't set shared goals up front, the diversity only serves to do fragmentation. You talk past each other, you don't have a shared language, you're not working the same objectives. And some might say what we're seeing right now in the United States and in Europe as well is that representative governments are not succeeding at setting shared goals up front, and therefore the diversity of their perspectives are fragmenting their societies. Any questions on that? Because you guys have been way too quiet so far. No? All right, well, we'll keep on going. So the next thing is the power of the edge. As mentioned, back in 2000, I joined a small little program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. We were about 30 people at the US Centers for Disease Control who were created back in 2000 because of concerns the sarin gas attacks that happened in the mid-1990s. And there were other cases where we could not find all the vials of smallpox that at the time when the Soviet Union did exist were being stockpiled. And so that was a concern. And about every 6 months we were told you're a Cold War relic, the budget might not be cut or something like that. We were told we didn't need to exist. And it had been scheduled months in advance for me to give a briefing on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise if we ever had to respond to a bioterrorism event. Unfortunately, 8:34, of course, the world changed. We literally piled computers into cars. That was the state of information sharing at the time, and set up an underground bunker and dealt with the response to both New York and DC and didn't get a lot of sleep. So down on October 1st, actually ended up giving the briefing to the CIA and the FBI on October 3rd, and the first case of anthrax shows up 24 hours later in Florida. It was a very busy time. Now, when I joined the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program as the one biology plus computer science person, I was a big advocate of what was called agile development. How many people know what agile development is? Excellent, you should know by now. How many people know that it's more than 16 years old? If you didn't, there was this thing called the Agile Manifesto that came out in March of 2001, and I was an early proponent of it. I was like, we need to follow this. This makes sense. I mean, we can't wait 3 years to build a solution. We've got to build it in iterations, and we've got to adjust and adapt, and that would make sense. But I was told, get back in my box, follow the 5-year plan, follow the 3-year budgetary cycle. What are you doing? What's this crazy idea? And I raise that because, unfortunately, after 9/11 happened, people said, well, why hadn't you done more? And it was like, well, because we had been following waterfall. Now, fortunately, we had done some things, and in fact, I had gotten in trouble for doing things with agile development, but we at least had some solutions when we actually had to respond to anthrax and actually make sense of all the laboratory results. In fact, we had a web-based solution that could actually make sense of all the lab test results because we had done an agile solution. But otherwise, had it not happened, I probably would have been a heretic and probably left my job about 6 or 9 months later. And so one of the things I swore is whenever I got to a position in which I was in a leadership mode, I would not assume at the top that I had all the answers. That really what I was trying to do was create an environment in which people could find solutions at the edge of their own, and I could provide top cover, because it's my job to take the hits. But really what I'm doing is setting the goal and the boundary conditions and allowing them to explore the space. Because in a hierarchy, if you wait for things to percolate to the top, you got a lag effect. And by the time it percolates back down, you've got another lag effect. And so it's really about empowering the edge as opposed to trying to do everything from the top. Now, it's not saying, again, that you don't need to have that top cover. In fact, I think that's key, that a good leader will provide that top cover. But it's inviting people to bring answers. It's also inviting people to be creative problem solvers. When I parachuted into a role in which I affectionately call digital diplomat and human flak jacket back in 2013, there have been several CIOs in the last 8 years. I think the average tenure was about 8 or 9 months. And I was like, oh, great. So how long am I going to last as FCC Chief Information Officer? The average person had been at the FCC for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been at the FCC for 19 years. And here I am trying to convince them, let's work together, let's try to figure out a way to move forward. And they're looking at their watches saying, are you going to be here past 6 months? So it was a challenge. I was a nonpartisan. But one of the things I did was I actually asked them what were our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as an organization. And I created as a poster. Anyone could write on it what they wanted. And I put it up in different places. And one thing that I noticed that was interesting is people were more than willing to email me what they thought, but they were hesitant to write on the poster themselves. I was like, well, that's odd. So about 2 weeks into the role, I actually got an all-hands meeting, and I said, I can only ask questions in this session. I can't impose my own views. And so I said, I've noticed that people are more than willing to email me their thoughts, but they don't seem willing to write it on the board. Does anyone know why? And people were quiet, but I knew one of the people in the audiences was an extrovert, so I called him, and I said, well, the previous leader would shout at us in public as to why we were wrong. And I was like, oh. What can I do to convince you that I won't be that way? And because, again, I could only ask questions. And that's a challenge, is if we don't allow people to at least have differences of opinion, and we don't respect that difference of opinion, then we're going to create cultures that are monolithic in nature, and they're going to repress any innovative ideas. There was another case where actually at the end of the talk, I said, so how many people are excited about where we're going? And to be honest, less than 15% were excited. I said, how many people are neutral? And that was about half. And they said, again, we're just waiting to see if you're here for the next 6 months. And I was like, thank you for that. And then I said, how many people wish that things could go back to the 1990s? And that was about another 35%. And someone said, actually, they said, I have a beef. And I said, tell me more. I said, it happened 17 years ago. And again, I had just arrived about 2 weeks ago. And I said, tell me more. And they told me what it was. And I listened. I said, thank you for sharing. What do you think we can do to move forward together from that? And I think that's a question that's often not asked. It's that you allow people to hold problems, but you don't turn it back around and say, okay, so what are you going to do about it? I imagine all of us in the room right now can think of some social condition or some social action in which we feel upset. We feel frustrated. We feel mad. We feel sad. But how many of us have then said, okay, let me channel that energy into actually doing something about it? I may not have all the answers, and it may just be at a local level or something like that. But how do we channel that to actually doing something and figuring out how to move forward from it, as opposed to just being angry or upset? So the third thing I'll put forward is the power of an ecosystem. And basically, this is similar in the sense that you don't tell ants where to go. They're not going to succeed if you do. Instead, you sprinkle sugar in certain places, you sprinkle poison in other places, and the ants will avoid the poison, and they'll figure out how to get the sugar in ways that you could never imagine. And they'll communicate amongst each other, and they'll swarm. And I think this is increasingly going to be key because the answers aren't going to come from any one sector. I like talking about public service versus just government. In fact, I may be a bit of a heretic having served in it, but I would say government is an increasingly 20th century term. What we really need to be talking about is public service. Public service, yes, it does include workers in government. It also includes public-private partnerships that think beyond their own bottom line, but think about a social bottom line as well. And it includes members of the public who want to, they don't all have to, but want to figure out some way to contribute to civic society. And I've actually seen this happen. I've actually seen satellite companies open source some of their images and actually had cases where they were do-it-yourself moms, retired fathers, things like that, that were looking through the open source imagery to help make sense of where possible famines might be or where there may be a need for disaster response. That used to be 10 years ago, that would only have been done by an intelligence community agency. But now it's a case of a private sector having launched satellites and then making it freely available for those interested parties to help make sense of where we can actually prevent humanitarian disasters. That's the type of world we're going into that requires that horizontal thinking as opposed to just saying it's just this one group's burden to solve. And so, that said, change isn't easy. Any guesses as to who this is a photo of? Anyone with the US Navy? This is a photo of young Ensign Nimitz in 1904, who ran his boat aground the USS Decatur. He was court-martialed for running his boat aground, but not drummed out of the Navy. And instead, 35 years later, he became one of 2 5-star admirals we've ever had. We usually only stop at 4 stars, but he helped us win the war in the Pacific. And I share that because think about this nowadays. An ensign, lieutenant with the US Navy runs their boat aground in the Philippines. How long on Facebook, how long on Twitter would have been Fire Nimitz? How many news pundits and comedians would have been, how could he have possibly done that? What is he doing? He's crazy. And probably he, his boss, and his boss's boss would have been called before Congress, and they would all have been kicked out. And the most depressing thing is actually, in reality, it's actually now part of naval code. You run your boat aground just once, and you're automatically out. So we've lost the ability for people to make mistakes and learn from it. And so the question is then, are we only selecting for leaders who are basically doing nothing? They're making it look like they do something, but they're really doing nothing. And so at the end, I say we get the government we deserve, we get the public service we deserve, we get the private sector we deserve. If we don't reward people actually taking on challenges and making a meaningful difference, even though they're going to make mistakes, then this is the world we're going to. And so change is not easy. You have to don flak jackets, and you have to be willing to incur that friction. And in fact, one of the things I like to talk about is the difference between management and leadership. Management is when you meet expectations. Expectations, whether it's from your boss, your peers, your reports, with expectations from the public, your shareholders, your investors, your VC community. We all have expectations to a degree that we have to meet or we're out of a job. I'm not saying you should not meet expectations. But I would say if you only meet expectations, you're not going to be able to keep up again with the exponential change we just talked about in the world. Leadership comes from the Greek word leet, which means to be sent unto death. Often this is where I like to ask who wants to be a leader anymore. Back in ancient Greece, the leets were the ones that carried a flag in front of the army. And that's all well and good until one army meets another army, and who's the first to die? The flag bearers, the leets. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was when he actually had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and convince them to make peace as opposed to have a violent coup. He almost did not succeed, but fortunately he encouraged the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the rest is history. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he turned to his own Israeli people and said he wanted to make peace with the Palestinians, unfortunately was assassinated by a fellow Israeli. Oftentimes, leaders are undone by their own support base when they get too far outside of expectations and they can't manage that friction. This is a challenge for leaders, and this is just something to be aware of, which is how far can you go in managing that friction, but not get too far that unfortunately you either get metaphorically or actually killed. And that's the art of leadership, is stepping outside of expectations. And we need people to step outside of expectations because the status quo we have right now is not good. And it's definitely not going to be good 4 years from now. And there are things that we need to do to embrace diversity, to embrace empowering the edge, and to work more horizontal. And so the question is, what can we each do to contribute to that? Again, just to give you a sense that the world we're going to is unprecedented. Internet Protocol version 4. This is how we used to, for the most part, address things on the internet. It's the 4 numbers that you're used to, the 4 octets. We ran out of these numbers about 18 months ago, the IP address. And there were about 4.3 billion of them, 2 to 32. And that was how we addressed things on the internet. We're now moving Internet Protocol version 6, which is a much more complicated system, 2 to 128th. But if you take all those numbers that used to be how we address things on the internet, 2 to 32, 4.3 billion numbers, and put them in a beach ball, what is the corresponding size object for Internet Protocol version 6, which is 2 to 128th? Planet? What if I told you we're going from the beach ball to the size of the sun with the internet? Again, this is going to raise questions of cybersecurity. How do you even begin to protect this? How do you defend against this? Privacy questions, civil liberties questions. How do we operate in this world? How do we make sense? Who owns your data? Do you? Hopefully, yes. That's what I would say, but other people have different opinions. How do we actually reward entrepreneurs in this space? How do we govern in this space? How do we have civil society in this space? How do we deal with fake news? Questions like this are unanswerable at the moment, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do experiments to figure this out. But I share this because, again, I'm with the people-centered internet. How many people know who Doug Engelbart was? Excellent, because it's an engineering school. I hope some people would. Doug Engelbart did the mother of all demos. And he did the mother of all demos about 50 years ago, actually 50 years ago of December this year, which he showed a graphical user interface. He showed a mouse. He showed talking to a computer. Now, it was simulated, but he was showing that this would be possibly in the future. He showed being able to click on things, which has now become a lot of the things we use nowadays. But his real vision for technology was that it would bring together different groups, and that technology would be a way of bringing different groups of people to share ideas, and then to learn from each other. This was a term called living learning communities, that different communities would try different things, and if something worked for them, they would make it available for other communities to take a look at and say, maybe I could adopt that same principle over here. But it would allow a plurality of communities trying to learn as opposed to monolithic cultures. Now, the first question I would say is, how many of you feel like the internet is bringing different groups of people together right now? I would personally not, I'm just saying. And I think we are increasing in an era in which we're picking people that think the same thing we do. None of us really like to be exposed to other people's thoughts that challenge us. But we need to go back to Abraham Lincoln, who actually said, I do not like that man. I must get to know him better. And it's interesting he picked the word know, because know actually comes from Greek meaning to have personal interactions with. It's not just gaining knowledge, but it's actually interacting with someone. And so the question is, for people whose views we may not subscribe to and might not like, how many of us are at least willing to try and interact and maybe walk a mile in their shoes and at least understand, even if we don't change our own views, what might have shaped them to reach that conclusion? Because we need people to build bridges. I just got back from Europe, where I was a Marshall Fellow for about 3.5 weeks. And I would say rise of nationalism, rise of anti-immigration sentiment. And I actually had this interesting conversation in Poland, Germany, and the UK, in which it was almost similar, where they said it feels like there's these two different societies, each who have their own news outlets, who don't talk to each other and don't work together. And it's increasing this polarization. And so that's why I think we need positive change agents who at least say it's okay to build bridges. It's okay to try and find a third way or fourth way or fifth way that's neither A nor B, but is something different and maybe can move people along. Again, I'm not saying you should give up on your views. You should hold your views, but you should begin to recognize that we need to figure out how we bring other people along, lest we sort of fragment and increasingly become tribal in nature. So the other thing that I'll try to do to give you an optimistic note is supposedly when the Constitution was signed, Ben Franklin said he could rest easy that the great American experiment could continue for the next 50 years. Now, clearly that was 240 years ago, and we're probably due for some more experiments, but he picked the word experiment, which to me is interesting because experiment and expertise both come from the Greek word experia, meaning out of danger. The only way you get expertise is use dangerous things that won't always work out. But again, going back to the Project Corona example, where are those safe spaces for us to figure out new ways of doing civil society together? Where are those safe spaces to try and figure out new business models? I mean, we have some in Silicon Valley, we have some in Austin, Texas, incubators, yes, for business, but what about the process of just coexisting? What about the process of making sense of having both a digital identity and a physical identity? What about just the process of living in this world that is rapidly changing? One of the conversations I had when I was a Marshall Fellow with the Bank of England, a very high-level individual said, if there's anything we're learning from Brexit, it's that we failed to listen to the rural areas of the country. And I said, well, tell me more. And it's basically that their perceptions, even if the world is getting better, they do not feel like it's getting better for them. And that may be either right or wrong, but if you don't listen to them, then it drives the wedge even further. And the way you think about it, globalization, the promise that we could actually rise all boats as we become more connected, what the economists did not tell you is it doesn't happen immediately. If you're in a country with a strong currency, there is a lag effect why other countries with a less strong currency take their time to rise up as well. And I think when we look back at the last 70 years, there's a wonderful good news story that about 1.1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. There's still a lot of work to do, and there's still poverty in the world, and we still have inequity. But what really has happened is, as jobs got offshored from developed countries to developing countries, that has helped bring them up. But now developed countries are beginning to ask, well, what about us? What about our rural areas that have seen industrial revolutions take away jobs from the rural areas, but not bring something back. And the Bank of England, there was an interesting conversation that said, we thought that free markets would basically reseed when jobs went away or when industry went away. They thought it was much like a forest that would automatically grow back. But what we were finding is when job displacement happens because of technology revolutions, because of automation, because of other advances in technology, it's a lot more like the Amazon rainforest. You cut down the Amazon rainforest, guess what? It's actually desert. It doesn't come back immediately. And so what we need to think about is, what are those places that have experienced what some might say the third industrial revolution going on the fourth industrial revolution, what others may call the digital revolution, that have seen jobs leave their communities, but have not seen entrepreneurialism bring something back and are frustrated and are upset at the world and are responding in interesting ways. What is our obligation to them to have empathy and say, I may not agree with all your views, but let me show you a way in which we can bring you up. We can actually help you be entrepreneurs in your community, and we can actually coexist in this world of increasing automation, the Internet of Everything, machine learning, and all these other disruptive technologies. We need more experiments. So back in 1994, Carl Sagan said, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home. That's us. Everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. We're going to need more positive change agents for the world ahead. I thank you for your time. Thanks for hosting me, and I'm now available for questions. No questions.
Just one.
Oh, excellent.
Draw right from the mic there.
I'll speak louder.
Oh, you can, okay.
Use the mic.
Use the mic. I think they want to hear you.
Thank you for that presentation. My question to you is, you haven't taken a stand on what you think the biggest challenges are for the next century. You mentioned information, you mentioned AI. What are your values considering that? Like, not all AI is beneficial.
Right.
The environment, food, so where does that fall into your view?
So I would say a couple things. First, I would say technology is inherently amoral. It's how we humans choose how to use it that decides whether it's good or bad. And so the same can be true for, fire. It's great, it cooks your food. Fire is awful because it can burn your enemies. Rocks can build fences, but they can also bash people in the head. So I would say all technology is, the morality of technology comes from the choices we make. I'm a Rawlsian in terms of philosophy. And for those of you who don't know, Rawlsian is basically the idea that at the moment you're born, you start to have biases as to what you think is just. And so he prescribes the veil of ignorance, which is step back and say, you're not born yet. What would we agree to as how do we coexist? And he would argue that basically what we would argue for is an era in which there may be, you want to at least encourage people to be entrepreneurs and succeed, but you also want to make sure there's not a wide disparity between those who are succeeding and those who are not. And so it's the idea that in whatever scenario you pick, make sure that those who are the worst off are the best off of all possible scenarios. And so what does that mean for the world? I know that's kind of abstract. I would say we need to figure out empathy for how we coexist. This is unprecedented to have 7.3, actually no, sorry, we're now 7.6 billion people. This is unprecedented in the human species. How do we coexist? What is a way that we can think beyond the us versus them phenomenon? It's a very human phenomenon. You can actually take groups of people that have worked together for 10 to 15 years, bonded well, coexisted well, and you bring them in a room and you randomly give them red beads and blue beads. And you say, go socialize for about 20 minutes, talk to each other in the blue team and the red team. And after about 20 minutes, you say, I'm going to give you each $10. You can keep the $10, you can wager some of it, or you can wager it all. Whichever team wagers the most will get double their money. The other team will get nothing. If there's a tie, nobody gets anything. And you'll watch these two teams, and they'll both convince themselves they're going to be more aggressive, they're going to be more brave, the other team's weak, they're not going to bet it all, and they'll bet it all. And guess what? The other team does too. And nobody gets anything. And that's just from 20 minutes of a red versus blue bead. And so I would submit there's so much of our lives right now. I actually wonder, personally, I feel like the internet has actually gotten more fragmented in the last 5 years. I wonder if that's occurring because we're now putting photos online. We're now putting videos online when I can remember back to the days when it was just text-based. So it was much more about the idea versus what you looked like. Now, again, ideas can also polarize as well, and you can identify with other groups as well. So that's not the only answer. But I figure out we have to figure out how to have empathy for people who have different views than our own, and at the same time have a way of uplifting and saying, let's move forward. Now, clearly some things are heinous, and I'm not saying we support everything, but how do we coexist in that world? So hopefully that helps a little bit. I don't have all the answers, but I can at least encourage other people to begin to help try to figure out those answers as well. Other questions?
I saw a few more hands back there.
There were.
Your
I think I saw one here. Oh, two there. Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. My question would be, how can you tell the difference between information and misinformation on the internet? Who should be responsible, the big companies or the government or the user itself? And I think moving forward in the future, how can you tell, information can be beneficial and also misinformation can be also disastrous?
Yes. If I had an answer for that, I'd probably have launched the company by now. That's a very hard question because, so I was talking to a retired, very high leader that said back in the late 1990s, the US had two doors to address involving the internet. Door number one was the concerns of cybersecurity. How do you know that the hardware is safe? How do you know the software is safe? How do you know the machine's doing what it's supposed to be doing? That's the first door. The second door is, how do you make sense of misinformation? How do you make sense of when people are trying to do information campaigns to mislead you or steer you in certain directions? That second door was a lot harder because we have freedom of speech. And so what one person's misinformation might be someone else's opinion. And then you also have the Fourth Amendment as well. And so how do you reconcile that? It's not something that government can really do well. And so the US picked door number one to try and address. And I'm not saying we're winning cybersecurity, but they at least picked door number one. Other countries may have picked the second door to get better at how do you make sense of propaganda, misinformation, and things like that. And so I think we are now facing that. I mean, we know already that just this year, if you get 37 seconds of someone's voice, you can create audio files of them saying things that they didn't actually say. So that's going to raise interesting questions of, do you actually say that or did you not? You've also probably already seen the videos where if you take someone's face and you get it from enough angles, you can actually put them on videos that they didn't actually do. Now, fortunately right now, it's still rudimentary, and so technology can be run to actually figure out that that video is not really them or the audio file is not really them. But it's going to get more advanced. And I think what we really need is healthy skepticism, because it's going to increasingly be hard to make sense of what's real and is what not real going forward. And in some points, you have to actually begin to wonder, does it really matter? I mean, it obviously will matter for maybe law enforcement purposes, but beyond that, should we make it more a society of ideas versus a society of personalities, or the cult of personality that we seem to be doing right now? But all I can say is it's going to get hard, and I don't have any magical answers other than to say it's going to get really hard.
There's another one right there. Thank you.
Hey, David, how are you?
Yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation, first and foremost. I liked the example that you gave of Doug Engelbert and his vision of the internet bringing people together. Recently, I was reading the book by Jonathan Taplin, Move Fast, Break Things, and he uses that example to take it in a different direction. A lot of his book is reserved for his animus towards Google and Amazon and Facebook as being monopolies. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on these kinds of topics, particularly given the role and the organization that you're a part of now, from a policy perspective. The way that these companies use our information and use sort of the advantages that they've accrued technologically, does that actually help further the aims of the internet from a humanistic point of view, or not?
So this is my personal opinion only. I'm going to not attribute this to people's internet. I would say the dream of the internet in the mid-90s, late 1990s was exactly that, bring people together. That if we had more knowledge, we'd find more truths and we'd all be more enlightened. I think what's turned out is the internet is mostly ads, whether it's overt ads or it's you feeding data that feed the ads. Now, that's allowed internet that we don't really pay a lot for, so that's a good. But the question now is, at what point in time is it harming how we live? Is it not healthy for us to always be thinking that we are now being made into a credit score? How many people know what Sesame social credit is, by the way? If you don't, you should Google this. or whatever search engine of your preference. I prefer DuckDuckGo, but anyway. You should research. Basically, in China, about 2.5 years ago, they introduced a voluntary system in which anybody would get a credit score for their online activities, plus their real-world activities. Post good things about the party, you buy from Alibaba, your score goes up. You post not so good things about the party, you don't buy from Chinese firms, your score goes down. But it also knows your social network, and it shows you your social network. And if you hang out with people with higher credit scores, they'll bring your scores up. You hang out with people with lower credit scores, they'll bring your scores down. So it's gamification of alienation of the minority. And there's rewards. You get faster internet, the higher your score goes up. You get slower internet, the lower your score goes down. You can't check into hotels. You can't take a plane if your score gets too low. Right now it's voluntary, but it's going to be mandatory by 2020. To me, this is something we should be talking about, because is that the model we want for the world? Again, I can understand and respect if China wants to do it for themselves. That's their own sovereignty to decide. But we need to have conversations about what do we do, and do we want to make sure that doesn't happen in our own country and other countries too. Now, in terms of the people-centered internet, to answer your question, and maybe this will also answer the first question that was asked, what's my vision of the future? You know, if your data was an apple that you were spending time growing on a tree, you wouldn't expect anyone to show up and take your apple and walk away without having a conversation. But it kind of feels like right now we are spending time producing data that people are either saying, here's a 40-page terms and conditions sheet, click here, and then the apple disappears. Or you're not really aware of how that apple is being used and you're seeing it disappear. I feel like, personally, it should be people-centered in nature. And so I think we need to have conversations about what are technologies that can do that. And I know there are fans of blockchain. I don't know if that's the answer, but I think the sentiment behind blockchain, or edge-directed graphs, or whatever it might be, is the idea that we need to have more of a locus of choice and decision about our data that's with us. If you choose to share no data, maybe you're doing the paid version of whatever that service is, and I'd be fine with that. Or maybe if you want to give some of your data, you get the free version. Or if you give even more data, you get other perks or things like that, or maybe they even pay you or something like that. So we need to introduce new models to that. But in terms of what you also said about these entities, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. And so they came in, they filled the space, and they've now made it difficult for others to come in. But this is classic. I mean, railroads did it. We've seen other industries do it as well. That, you know, I mean, 0 to 1. Peter Thiel said, you should make yourself a monopoly, and then you should proceed to hide the fact that you are a monopoly by saying you do other things too. And so I think what we need to figure out is a way to disrupt that model, because I think we need more innovation, and we need people that can think about this from a people-centered perspective, because I get that your technology, you're never going to figure out how it's going to have second and order effects. I've had that happen to myself where we thought it was going to be used for a good purpose, and then we saw later people use it for other purposes. But I try to always do an autocorrect. And so I think the same thing's true here. We need people to experiment, to try and figure out ways that are more people-centered in nature, how we can actually bring together civ tech plus other types of technologies, and bring together the world as opposed to polarize the world. Now, we've not had a woman ask a question. There we go. Okay, good. I have to make sure we get some diversity, so thank you.
So you're asking me to ask a question.
No. I was leaning forward if you wanted to.
Sure, and I'm leaning in.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to ask you a simple question. What's your strategy in attracting change agents and encouraging them?
So that's a great question. I think change agents like to be around other change agents, but it's challenging because you want to create a space in which you say you are free to explore and beyond. I mean, give a locus of control. And so actually the philosophy I have is like, if you come in, I will give you autonomy, I'll give you measurable progress or the ability to see your progress and a meaningful mission, which often for a change agent is exciting. But you also then have to figure out, and you have to help them recognize you're going to be coexisting with other people that may be different change agents that have different views on where to go. And you have to be okay with that we're not necessarily all going to be going in the same direction, but that's fine. And at a certain point in time, we'll have to figure out where it makes sense. It's also encouraging change agents to be empathetic for those who are not as inclined to be change agents yet. You know, I've seen this happen so many times where you have an existing organization that may have ossified, it may have become legacy in nature, and you try to bring positive change agents from the outside, and they come in with, you know, they've got exciting ideas, they're ready to go in many different directions, and that's good, you want that. But if you don't figure out a way to also bring along the existing personnel, it quickly becomes the cool kids versus the existing kids, and that's not good. And so you have to say it's one team, one mission. And also just begin to understand, why did the people that are not as inclined to be positive change agents become that way? Maybe they were never given permission. Maybe they tried and they hit their head against the wall so many times. Maybe they were shamed. Maybe they tried something and it didn't work out and they were shouted out. And so I often like to meet with everybody, including people who are not positive change agents yet, and say, what brings you joy? What would be exciting to take on? And I know this is a weird question for someone who's a scientist to say, but if you can figure out what someone's passionate about, maybe I can give you an opportunity to do that. Other questions? Yep, we got one in the far back.
Dr. Gray, I appreciate your presentation. It was very well done. Question has to do with the intellectual property that we have. How can we best protect that in the future, given the rate of change we're going through right now?
That's a really good question, especially because you've got the idea itself, the intellectual property, but then you've got 3D and now 4D manufacturing. You know, if you get a hold of that, then I'm sorry to say I don't have any easy answers other than to say I think we need to have a conversation about how we update it for the 21st century. I think we definitely need to reward entrepreneurs. We need to reward inventors. At the same time, we need to recognize, it's almost like how, if you can remember, when the music industry tried to resist Napster, and then later we had, you know, and Napster didn't make it, but then eventually Apple figured out a model. I'm not saying Apple is the only model, and now we've got Spotify and others coming along. There may be other ways to recognize and reward the people that come up with the original idea versus the current system we have. And we also want to make sure that copyright does not prevent freedom of sharing ideas. I feel like we're not having this conversation as a country because it's hard to have in a soundbite. But if we don't encourage the people that are running for office, and by the way, I'm never going to run for office as far as I know. I think my wife would hit me over the head if I did. I like being a nonpartisan, but I think if we don't encourage those people who are possibly going into representative government to have this conversation, then we should be surprised that no reforms coming down the road. And so whatever we can do to put that, maybe it's on education institutions to elevate the conversation, working with the private sector to say, what would it look like? What are the issues? I'm actually going to be doing a course, it's a short half-day course in about 2 weeks, in which they asked me to talk about the future of governance. And I was like, I can't tell you what the future of governance is. I can tell you possibilities, but I can't tell you what it is. And so we're actually going to do it as a simulation, where we're going to have a problem and we're going to have different people take on different issues. And so at least we can begin to understand the different dimensions of that. But you hit the nail on the head, which is, if we don't figure out how to embrace intellectual property, but at the same time embrace sharing of ideas, sharing of physical bits and matter as well, we're not going to be able to keep up with the world change. Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt at this point because we have a reception next door. Everybody's invited, so please. He has a high credit score, so.
Oh, no. You all have brought up my score, so I thank you for that.
But I just want to sum up by saying, wow, what an inaugural lecture to kick off this lecture series. You've raised more questions than, I don't know, I've heard in 6 months. And I wonder actually if in 2118, the speaker in this series will refer back to Dr. Bray in 2018.
And say how much of it was actually right. We'll see.
We solved one of the problems, but not another.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
this is wonderful, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
So everybody please join.
Thank you.